November 1942. The desert air outside Kasserine Pass hung thick with dust and cordite as American tanks burned along the narrow roads, their silhouettes sharp against the Tunisian hills. Radio traffic crackled with confusion, orders collided, and units hesitated. For the first time, U.S. Army formations faced seasoned German forces in open combat, and the result was brutal and unmistakable poor coordination, exposed flanks, and hard lessons learned in real time. Yet even as the smoke settled, something unusual began to happen. Reports were written, commanders were relieved, and tactics were questioned without hesitation. What looked like defeat was quietly becoming a laboratory, and from that laboratory, a different kind of army would emerge. In 1939, while Europe descended into war, the United States Army remained small, cautious, and largely untested, ranking behind several nations in size. Its officer corps was professional, but its combat experience was thin. Budgets through the interwar years had been limited, training exercises theoretical, and ammunition rationed even in drills. Across the Atlantic, the situation was different. Germany's army had been hardened in Poland and France, refined by fast-moving campaigns and unforgiving losses. Britain's forces had fought a global empire war for decades, adapting slowly through institutional tradition, while Japan's military had been fighting continuously in China since 1937, learning brutal lessons in jungle and urban warfare. The American way of war, by contrast, had been shaped by distance, with two oceans providing insulation, doctrine emphasizing mobilization over immediacy, and potential over readiness. Everything changed on December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor shattered strategic assumptions overnight. Within weeks, the United States committed to fighting on multiple continents against enemies with years of battlefield momentum. Factories surged to life. Divisions multiplied on paper faster than they could be trained in reality. Young officers were promoted rapidly, and entire formations deployed before they were fully prepared. The U.S. Army entered the war knowing one thing with certainty: it had to learn fast, or it would lose fast. By 1942, American forces were fighting on two vastly different fronts. In North Africa, U.S. troops encountered German armored doctrine at full strength, while in the Pacific, they faced an enemy whose discipline, endurance, and defensive preparation exceeded pre-war expectations. Early engagements exposed systemic weaknesses. Command structures were rigid at lower levels. Infantry, armor, and artillery often operated as separate entities rather than a single force, and communications lagged behind the pace of modern combat. But these failures were not ignored, they were documented in detail. After action, reports moved rapidly up the chain of command, training manuals were revised mid-war, and entire tactical doctrines were rewritten while battles were still ongoing. This willingness to acknowledge error distinguished the American experience. Where other armies often protected tradition or hierarchy, the U.S. Army treated doctrine as provisional. If something failed under fire, it was not defended, it was replaced. The North African campaign became a proving ground. Commanders were reassigned without ceremony, units were trained between engagements, sometimes within weeks, and by the time American forces prepared for their next major test, the army that emerged was already different from the one that arrived: more flexible, more integrated, and more willing to decentralize decision-making. This transformation did not happen in isolation. It unfolded under constant pressure, shaped by enemy action and internal reform, setting the stage for the deeper forces driving adaptation, the systems, cultures, and decisions that allowed change to occur at wartime speed. The first force driving American adaptation was institutional learning. From the beginning, the U.S. Army treated combat as data. After every engagement, reports were compiled with unusual speed and candor. Failures were not softened. Units named what broke, where it broke, and why. These reports were not buried, they were circulated, analyzed, and acted upon. At Fort Leavenworth and other command schools, instructors revised lesson plans while the war was still unfolding, and field manuals were updated in real time. By 1943, soldiers arriving in Europe trained with doctrine shaped by battles for only months earlier. The second factor was command accountability. American senior leadership showed a readiness to remove commanders who could not adapt. After Kasserine Pass, General Lloyd Fredendall was relieved, and his replacement, George S. Patton, brought stricter discipline, clearer command lines, and aggressive combined arms coordination. This was not personal, it was systemic. The U.S. Army valued effectiveness over seniority, and officers who failed to learn were replaced by those who could. Training reflected this urgency. Large-scale maneuvers in the United States simulated real combat conditions with increasing realism. Mistakes were expected and punished before troops ever reached the front. Equally important was decentralization. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers were encouraged to make decisions when communication broke down. Radios, increasingly standardized across units, allowed faster coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. This created a feedback loop. Front-line improvisation informed doctrine, doctrine reshaped training, and training improved battlefield performance. By mid-war, American units operated less like rigid formations and more like adaptive systems. They were not flawless, but they were responsive, and responsiveness under the pressure of modern war became a decisive advantage. These internal mechanisms were amplified by material power and technological integration, factors that accelerated adaptation beyond what doctrine alone could achieve. American adaptability was accelerated by logistics, not merely the ability to supply armies, but the ability to change what was being supplied. When equipment failed in combat, it was redesigned. Tank armor was reinforced, aircraft received upgraded guns and radios, and infantry units gained improved artillery coordination and close air support procedures. This responsiveness was rooted in industrial scale. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and California operated in direct dialogue with the front, with feedback from the battlefield reaching engineers in weeks, not years. Technology became connective tissue. Radios allowed platoons to coordinate fire in real time, forward observers directed artillery with increasing precision, and air-ground coordination evolved rapidly, especially in Europe. Other armies struggled here. German forces innovated brilliantly, but production was fragmented and constrained by shortages. Britain adapted methodically, but institutional caution slowed widespread change, and Japan, constrained by limited industrial capacity and rigid command culture, struggled to revise doctrine under fire. The U.S. Army also benefited from coalition warfare. Fighting alongside British forces exposed Americans to hard-earned experience, but rather than inheriting tradition wholesale, the U.S. selectively absorbed what worked. American commanders adopted British lessons in amphibious warfare, while rejecting practices that limited initiative. By 1944, this synthesis produced an army comfortable with combined arms warfare at scale, where infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power operated as interlocking components. Adaptation became habit rather than exception, yet adaptability was ultimately tested not in theory but under maximum pressure when plans collapsed, when weather intervened, when enemies struck unexpectedly. Before dawn, the English Channel heaved under gray skies and heavy seas. Thousands of Allied ships moved toward the coast of Normandy, their wakes overlapping in silence. For the U.S. Army, this was no longer an experiment. It was a test of everything learned since 1942. At Omaha Beach, American forces encountered conditions far worse than anticipated. Strong currents scattered landing craft, German defensive positions remained largely intact, and machine gun fire cut through the surf. Early waves suffered devastating losses, units were pinned, and communications collapsed almost immediately. But the response was different from North Africa. Small unit leaders adapted without waiting for orders. Naval gunfire was redirected closer to shore, engineers cleared obstacles under fire, and infantry reorganized around surviving officers and sergeants. Within hours, improvised command structures emerged. Fire teams advanced by terrain, not plan, and artillery observers pushed forward to call support directly onto German positions. This adaptability was not accidental. It reflected months of integrated training, revised doctrine, and realistic rehearsal. When the original plan failed, replacement methods were already understood. By nightfall, American forces held a fragile but expanding foothold. Losses were severe, but the beachhead stood. In the weeks that followed, the pattern repeated across Normandy. Hedgerow fighting exposed new challenges, and American units responded with rapid innovation, field-modified tanks, coordinated infantry armor teams, and evolving tactics for close combat. Each adjustment was disseminated quickly, and what worked in one division appeared in another within days. Normandy became the proving ground where adaptation turned into momentum. Yet the ultimate measure came later, when the enemy regained initiative and the margin for error disappeared. On December 16, 1944, before sunrise, a dense fog settled over the Ardennes forest. Snow muffled movement, roads vanished under ice, and then German artillery broke the silence. The counteroffensive that followed was the largest Germany would launch in the West. Veteran panzer divisions drove into thinly held American lines, exploiting weather and surprise. For a moment, the front fractured. What happened next revealed how far the U.S. Army had come. Isolated units held positions without orders, understanding intent rather than waiting for instruction. Supply officers rerouted fuel and ammunition under fire. Engineers destroyed bridges, then rebuilt them days later to support counterattacks. Command adapted in hours, not weeks. General Eisenhower authorized rapid redeployment of entire armies. Air-ground coordination plans were revised as weather cleared, and overwhelming air power was unleashed. At Bastogne, surrounded American forces reorganized internally, conserving strength and coordinating defense through decentralized leadership. Relief columns adjusted routes on the move, and artillery fires were massed with speed and precision unmatched earlier in the war. German forces, by contrast, struggled to adapt once momentum slowed. Fuel shortages compounded rigid planning, and commanders lacked flexibility to revise objectives under changing conditions. By January, the offensive was broken, and the initiative had permanently shifted. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated not just resilience, but institutional maturity. The U.S. Army absorbed shock, analyzed failure, and responded with speed. Adaptation was no longer reactive, it was embedded. From the deserts of Tunisia to the forests of Belgium, the transformation was complete, and when the fighting subsided, the consequences extended far beyond the battlefield into doctrine, leadership, and the future of modern war. By early 1945, the results of American adaptation were unmistakable.